I can tell you what the Chinese did very well was vertical integration. And they were talking about how they had a 50-year plan to dominate rare earths. And I said, well, that's interesting. Why are you doing that? And they said, well, because we think rare earths are going to be much more important than they are now. Basically, the U.S. controls global payments and the U.S. dollar reserve currency. China controls global trade and global manufacturing effectively. If you don't invest in certain areas in China, then we could end up isolating ourselves. In other words, we could be the USSR in a future Cold War where we decide to cease investment. I hate to say it, but they kind of even make Tesla look a little bit outdated. I mean, they iterated 7 generations in 3 years.
Mitchell Presnick, an American entrepreneur and investor best known for bringing the Super 8 Hotels brand to China, where he played a key role in the country's booming hospitality industry. In this video, Mitchell offers deep insights into the nation's economic trajectory and why he remains optimistic about its future.
I spent 30 years in China, so I've actually lived in China longer than I've lived in the US. That means I have the good fortune to have seen a lot of the greats who have done business in China from the West and a lot of the great politicians. I've known every US ambassador to China up until 2012. I spent a lot of time with even the early ones who were basically coming from the security apparatus in the US. So I got a good dose of that piece early on. My mentor was Sidney Rittenberg, the man who stayed behind. He was jailed by Mao for 7 years, almost 7 years, because he was accused by Stalin of being a US spy when he was with Mao and the other leaders in Yan'an. And then he was jailed again by Jiang Qing, Mao's wife, who was part of the Gang of Four, during the Cultural Revolution because he tried to save some of his colleagues from persecution. So my training comes from people who are certainly not panda huggers. On the other hand, I come from the business community, which has been very constructive on China for reasons that I'll get into, but I can promise you it's not because we're a bunch of folks running around with monocles chasing shiny dimes. It's because we understand that the shared interests that the U.S. and China, have together in that Venn diagram are as important to creating global stability as anything that can be produced on the political economic side, because it's actually the shared interests that have kept this relationship going. And believe it or not, it hasn't always been smooth sailing. We almost had a disengagement around the time of China's accession to the WTO, and that was a very close call, and it would have resulted in exactly where we are now, but 20 years earlier, where you had a much more desperate China, more unstable. It could have easily been North Korea times 10,000. So the relationship always having been characterized by some combination of cooperation and competition. The one common ground has always been that it's on a continuum, and that continuum has swung back and forth. Right now we're 80% competition, 20% cooperation, but nonetheless, it's important to put the current world in context that we are in a place that looks familiar. It's certainly heading back in the right direction now, because I think both sides looked over at the abyss and decided that it's better for us to try to add a third C, which is communication. There's a hawk argument and there's a dove argument, and then there's where are they both bringing kernels of truth? Real estate. I get nervous when people, and they do it a lot now. They speak in very hopeful terms about, well, China's population is a massive problem for the country and it's going to bring them down, or China's workforce is aging very quickly and they don't have much, or they've got tons of ghost cities, or let's unpack a couple just so you can kind of understand how I look at the world through my eyes. So real estate, obviously Super 8's in the real estate business as well as the economy hotel business, so it's an area we know well. So there are about 90 million empty units in China that represent an investment in the trillions. Now people say, well, that's weird, that's dead assets and everything else. But on the other hand, China has urbanized 750 to 800 million people in the last 30 years. So uh, which do you choose to focus on? You can choose to focus on 90 million units. That's true. That's a problem. But they could fix that problem if they created the tax structures to incentivize owners to rent those out. And for the blocks that were owned by bankrupt real estate developers, they could have those things put into separate LLCs, and they could be repackaged. And just as the US kind of handled the aftermath of the GFC, Chinese could do that too. So I get nervous when people say, oh, but the real estate, that bubble is going to collapse. First of all, it's not a strategy. And hope is not a strategy, even for those that would wish that. And second of all, it doesn't necessarily show the whole story. EV and solar. China has an overcapacity of EV and solar. We saw Secretary Yellen go over just a couple of weeks ago, and that's a real concern. On the other hand, China has reduced their oil usage by 50 terawatts of energy. The only major country to reduce oil usage at that scale. And they did it because of this overcapacity of solar and wind. China will have 1,400 gigawatts of solar and wind generating capacity by 2025. That's next year. That's more than the entire installed base of energy generation in all of Europe, just solar and wind. So I mean, so on the one hand, we can complain about their overcapacity, and we'd be right. On the other hand, what they're doing is giving a massive support to the idea that we might have a lower carbon future. So these are the kinds of things that we need to look at and evaluate them with clear eyes. I can tell you what the Chinese did very well was vertical integration. They were able to, call it industrial policy, call it industrial coordination. What they decided was that, here are the key opportunities for the country over the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. And let's get government, let's get academia, let's get science, let's get commercial and finance all around those things, and let's make progress. So I was trading rare earths with China in 1992 when I was working for an American uranium trader based in Denver. I was based in Hong Kong at the time, but the company was headquartered in Denver. And I remember going into Minmetals, which was one of the Chinese state-owned metals trading companies. You probably heard of them. And they were talking about how they had a 50-year plan to dominate rare earths. And I said, well, that's interesting. Why are you doing that? And they said, well, because we think rare earths are going to be much more important than they are now. What we foresee is that, lots of the technologies of the future are going to need rare earths, and we want to corner it. And we're surprised that other people aren't doing the same. And I went back and I made a proposal to my company that we start buying up, or we set up a separate fund to start acquiring and developing rare earths, mining and refining capabilities. It wasn't successful, but that's what happens when you have a country that has the benefits of command capitalism, as it were. It's an advantage. They can take a longer term view. I can tell you, as someone who comes from the business world, we have to focus on serving our stakeholders in the short term, and we don't always get to serve our stakeholders equally, because some stakeholders will run us out, and others will be more patient. China doesn't have that issue. So they produce more STEM graduates than the rest of the world combined. Do they cheat? Absolutely. Every chance they get. I mean, like we had fake Super 8s all over the country. We couldn't get, I mean, when we would try to enforce our franchise agreements for years and years, we had a lot of support from the central government, but when it came down to execution, and a lot of China happens at the local level. Like that's one thing people don't realize. They think of it as this monolith that China, the Chinese central government controls everything, and actually, a lot of the real governing happens at the local level. I'll give you an example. I mentioned that China had invested about 9 trillion in infrastructure in the last 15 years. Well, 7 trillion of that was local government funded. Only 2 trillion of that was central government. And And that means that they control the majority of where the money is going. So they're also doing the majority of the cheating, the majority of the IP theft, the majority of everything. It may all be kabuki theater behind the scenes. They may all be happy about it and coordinating, but the fact that they take a whole country effort to the things that are important to them is the takeaway message. Not that they don't cheat or that cheating was the only way they got here. They got there because they produced more STEM grads than the rest of the world combined for the last 10 years. I mean, they're producing like 1.4 million STEM grads annually. The US is producing, a small fraction of that, right? We don't even have enough for the jobs that are available in this country. Um, and that's the kind of disparity that contributes to the problem. So it's only helpful to look at a solution to the problem in a holistic way. I always make the argument that we should be developing a new playbook for our relationship with China for this reason, that we should actually be learning from them and from a position of humility the way they learn from us. I mean, when I look back on the conversations that we used to have at AmCham in the early 90s, the kinds of humility that they were able to display, despite the fact that they were a perennial champion in the global World Cup of business, it was pretty impressive when I look back on it. I kind of think about those days wistfully because they were so fun to work with, with that combination of talent and humility that there's a little less humility now. But nonetheless, that's what I would answer. That
Yeah.
it's both. Yeah. Is China uninvestable in certain areas? Yeah, yeah, it is now. I would say, and not necessarily because we intended it that way or that they intended it that way, but because business is always about risk return, and right now the risk return profile in certain areas just isn't favorable for us. But having said that, um, you know, just given the fact that China is so deeply embedded into global supply chains and global technology and rare earths, and look, basically the U.S. controls global payments and the U.S. dollar reserve currency. China controls global trade and global manufacturing effectively. Um, that means that unlike the Cold War, where we could just cut ties and not invest with them, the challenge of doing that now is we cut off access to key technology if we do that now. So being uninvestable isn't really even in our interest. And more so, if you don't invest in certain areas in China, then we could end up isolating ourselves. In other words, we could be the USSR in a future Cold War where we decide to cease investment. That's the challenge with us. That's where the comparisons to the Cold War with the USSR are really fraught. Now, on the question of consumer products, I mean, the truth is that when we were in China in the 90s and in the aughts, yeah, we enjoyed an incredible position as operators of foreign brands. And I actually went to China with a business plan that I wrote while I was an undergrad, that I thought China would need brands. They would need to understand IP. Coming out of command communism for 35 years, they wouldn't have any idea what an IP was, or how to develop a brand, or how to look at a brand as a living thing that one would nurture and it would create value over time. So branding was one of the great opportunities to bring to China. But they've now learned that, and their brands are incredible. They've got great brands. Their EV cars. I mean, I was in Beijing in December. Uh, I hate to say it, but they kind of even make Tesla look a little bit outdated. I mean, they iterated 7 generations in 3 years. 7 generations. That's more than 2 generations per annum. At a time that we were convinced that there was nothing happening in China, when the executives from GM, SAIC, and Tesla, Tesla really didn't leave, but most of the ICE corporations, Toyota, VW, when they got back and they saw how much progress the Chinese had made, they were flabbergasted. So, to your question on whether the brands that we have are still relevant, sure. Everything in China is a pendulum, and the one thing that Chinese are not is brand loyal. So even if they're at the moment showing a preference for local brands, I could also argue that McDonald's plans to open 10,000 new restaurants in the next 5 years. That Super 8, we've seen our business, very, very ebullient, I would say, in the last 2 years. And we're a U.S. brand, and we make no bones about that. So I would say it's a mixed picture. I think I would say this though, to answer Greg's question most directly, the opportunities that we saw in the engagement period are over. The opportunities we have now are more in the area of what can we do together in the global south? What can we manufacture? How can we address global issues with China? Because we can ring fence that. Even during the height of the Cold War, the U.S. and USSR worked together on smallpox. Even during the height of the Cold War with the USSR, we created Soyuz missions, the joint space missions. So I think there's things we can find out. I think that's the model, an unemotional middle way model where we find things that we can work on, where our interests are clearly aligned, and then we have areas that are investable because now we're creating a positive risk return profile again.